In 1990, Claire Bennett was 23 years old and already carried more responsibility than most people her age. She lived in Youngstown, Ohio with her mother, Margaret Bennett, and her 16-year-old brother, Ryan. Their father had died years earlier, leaving Margaret to manage a household on a modest income and Claire to grow up faster than she had expected. By the time Ryan entered high school, Claire had become the steady center of the family. She worked at a restaurant near the industrial district, contributed what she could to household expenses, helped Ryan stay focused on school, and rarely complained about how narrow her own life had become. Ryan trusted her more than anyone. Their relationship had been shaped by years of shared hardship rather than by dramatic promises. Claire was the person who remembered school deadlines, noticed when money was short, and made sure Margaret did not carry every burden alone. Ryan understood that his sister had given up many ordinary freedoms to keep the family stable. Because of that, when someone finally appeared to offer Claire a different future, part of him wanted to believe she deserved it. That man was Derek Lawson. Derek was 28 and new to Youngstown. He said he worked in industrial equipment sales and traveled often for business. He seemed financially secure, confident, and familiar with a world far removed from the Bennett family's routine. He paid for expensive dinners, spoke about opportunities in other states, and presented himself as a man who had already built the kind of stability Claire had never experienced. Margaret liked him almost immediately. To her, Derek appeared responsible and serious about Claire. After years of watching her daughter sacrifice time and money for the family, Margaret wanted Claire to have a life of her own. Ryan never felt the same. He could not point to one single incident that proved anything was wrong. What bothered him was the pattern. Derek rarely gave clear answers about his family. He had no old friends in town and no stories that could easily be checked. He disliked Claire spending long evenings with people she had known before meeting him. He also seemed to have an opinion about nearly every decision she made, from where she worked to how often she visited certain friends. Claire interpreted those things differently. After years of making every decision alone, Derek's certainty felt less like control and more like relief. He offered plans instead of problems. He talked about a future in which Claire would not have to count every dollar or worry about whether Margaret could cover the electric bill. The possibility of a different life mattered to her, even when Ryan remained uneasy. Their relationship moved quickly. Within several months, Claire and Derek were engaged. The wedding was small, practical, and attended mostly by family and people Claire knew from work. For Margaret, it represented something hopeful after years of loss. For Ryan, it created an anxiety he could not explain without sounding unreasonable. That uneasiness became stronger almost immediately after the marriage. Derek announced that he had been offered a position in Tucson, Arizona. He said the opportunity was too good to refuse and that the move needed to happen soon. Claire had spent her entire life in Ohio. Margaret was still struggling financially, and Ryan still depended heavily on his sister. Leaving them was not something Claire had planned. Derek insisted the move was necessary. Claire eventually agreed. Before leaving Youngstown, she made Ryan one promise. She would call home every Sunday. Distance would not change what they meant to each other. Arizona might become her new home, but Ryan would still hear from her every week. For the first several weeks, she kept that promise. The calls usually came on Sunday evenings. Claire talked about Tucson, about adjusting to a new place, and about trying to settle into married life. Yet something in her voice began to change. Ryan noticed it before Margaret did. Claire sounded careful. Her answers were shorter than they had been in Ohio. Questions about Derek often led to vague explanations. When Ryan asked whether she was happy, the answer always came quickly, almost too quickly. By late summer, the calls became shorter. Sometimes Ryan could hear another voice in the background. He assumed it was Derek, though Claire rarely acknowledged it directly. At other times, she seemed to end the call before she had finished what she wanted to say. Margaret tried to reassure Ryan that marriage and relocation were difficult adjustments, especially for someone who had never lived away from family. Ryan wanted to believe that, but the feeling that something was wrong never disappeared. Then came a Sunday in September 1990. The usual time for Claire's call passed. No call came. Margaret thought perhaps Claire had forgotten or had gone out with Derek. Ryan knew his sister better than that. Claire had built her life around keeping promises to the people she loved. A missed call did not fit who she was. Hours later, the phone finally rang. Claire was on the line. This time, there was no attempt to sound normal. She told Ryan that things were not what the family believed. She said Derek was not the man they thought he was. She was frightened, and she wanted to leave him. She wanted to come back to Ohio. Ryan understood only fragments of what had happened, but one fact was unmistakable. Claire did not feel safe. She also told him that if anything happened, he needed to look after their mother. The conversation ended suddenly. Ryan heard a violent disturbance through the phone line, followed by Claire's terrified cry. Then there was nothing. The connection was gone. Ryan tried to reach her again, but no one answered. By the next morning, Claire Bennett had vanished. Ryan and Margaret reported Claire missing as soon as it became clear that the final phone call had not been followed by any contact. What they could describe to police was disturbing but incomplete. Claire had said she was afraid of Derek, had said she wanted to leave him, and had asked Ryan to take care of their mother if something happened. Then the call had ended after a sudden disturbance and a terrified cry. The problem was jurisdiction. Claire was no longer living in Ohio. She and Derek had moved to Tucson, Arizona, and the Youngstown police could not simply treat an adult woman in another state as the victim of a local crime without evidence. The family was told that information would have to be passed to law enforcement in Arizona, where officers could check the residence and determine whether there was any immediate sign of danger. For Ryan, the waiting was unbearable. He had been 16 when Claire left Ohio and still believed that adults in authority would understand the meaning of what he had heard. To him, there was no uncertainty. His sister had been frightened. She had wanted to come home. Something had interrupted the call. When Arizona authorities finally checked the address connected to Claire and Derek, they found Derek there. His explanation was simple. According to him, the marriage had been deteriorating for weeks. Claire had been unhappy. He claimed they had argued, after which she packed some personal belongings, took cash from the residence, and left. He further claimed she had gone away with another man. The account immediately sounded false to Ryan. Claire had spent most of her life protecting her family. She had never shown any intention of cutting them off. More importantly, her final call had not sounded like someone preparing to leave voluntarily with another person. She had sounded frightened of Derek himself. But police had to work with what they could prove. The residence did not show obvious signs of a violent struggle. There was no visible blood, no weapon tied to an assault, and no witness who could place Claire in immediate danger after the call. Some of her personal belongings were missing. She was 23 years old, legally free to leave a marriage without telling anyone where she was going. In the absence of stronger evidence, the case was treated as an adult missing person matter with the possibility that Claire had left voluntarily. That distinction changed everything. A case believed to involve abduction or homicide would have triggered a different level of urgency. A case involving an adult who might have chosen to disappear placed far more limitations on what investigators were likely to pursue, especially in 1990, before modern digital records, cell phone tracking, widespread surveillance cameras, and interconnected databases made movement easier to trace. Ryan refused to accept the explanation. Margaret tried to hold on to the possibility that Claire was alive somewhere, even if she could not understand why her daughter would remain silent. Ryan believed something darker had happened. He returned repeatedly to the final phone call, especially Claire's warning about Derek and the abrupt ending. Then Derek disappeared from the picture as well. Not long after Claire was reported missing, he left Arizona. The contact information associated with him stopped leading anywhere useful. There was no clear trail back to relatives, old friends, or an established life that investigators could easily verify. To Ryan, that only strengthened his suspicion. If Claire had truly abandoned Derek for another man, he could not understand why Derek would leave so quickly afterward. If Derek had nothing to hide, his sudden departure seemed difficult to explain. Still, suspicion was not evidence. The months became years. Ryan finished school and entered adulthood carrying a question that never stopped following him. Every milestone came with Claire's absence attached to it. There was no funeral because there was no body. There was no confirmed crime because there was no crime scene. There was no reunion because Claire never called. Margaret lived with the same uncertainty. For a parent, not knowing proved to be its own kind of loss. She could not fully mourn Claire because some part of her remained convinced that her daughter might still return. Yet she could not move forward as though Claire were simply living elsewhere either. Ryan continued searching whenever he found a new possibility. He checked directories. He contacted agencies. He held on to old photographs, wedding records, names, dates, and anything connected to Derek. As technology slowly improved, he tried new databases and public record searches. Most produced nothing. Eventually, Ryan married a woman named Claire Bennett and built a family of his own. He became a husband and a father, but Claire remained part of his life in a way that never required her presence. Natalie knew the story. She knew why Ryan saved old documents other people might have thrown away decades earlier. She knew why unfamiliar names from Arizona or Oregon could suddenly become important to him. Margaret died without ever learning what happened to her daughter. That loss changed Ryan's search. Before his mother's death, part of his effort had always been about bringing Claire home to her. Afterward, the search became more personal. Ryan wanted the truth because there was now no one else left from that old household who could demand it. By 2021, 31 years had passed since Claire vanished. The world in which Ryan was searching had changed completely from the one in which she disappeared. Local newspapers had moved online. Community organizations posted photographs publicly. Small-town events were documented on websites and social media pages. Public records that once required letters, phone calls, or physical visits could sometimes be found from a home computer. Ryan began searching more aggressively through community pages, public photo albums, archived local posts, and older online records. He was no longer searching only for the name Claire Bennett. He had learned that names could disappear. Faces were harder to erase. One night, while going through photographs connected to a fall festival in Oak Ridge, Oregon, Ryan found an image that stopped the search cold. The woman in the photograph appeared to be in her early 50s. Her hair had changed with age. Her face carried 3 decades that Ryan had never witnessed. But several features were immediately familiar. Then he noticed the mark near her neck. Claire had always had a distinctive mark in that area, something Ryan remembered from childhood and family photographs. The resemblance was too strong to dismiss. Ryan checked the information associated with the image. The woman was not identified as Claire Bennett. She was listed under another name, Rebecca Carter. For the first time in 31 years, Ryan was no longer searching for a missing sister who might be dead. He was staring at the possibility that Claire had been alive all along. Ryan did not treat the photograph from Oak Ridge as proof by itself. After 31 years of searching, he understood how easily hope could turn resemblance into certainty. He had seen strangers before who reminded him of Claire. He had followed names that led nowhere and records that belonged to entirely different families. This time felt different, but feeling was not enough. The name attached to the photograph was Rebecca Carter. Ryan began searching that name through every public source he could find connected to Oak Ridge, Oregon. He checked community pages, local organizations, archived announcements, small-town newsletters, and older newspaper records that had been digitized over the years. Rebecca Carter appeared several times, not as a mysterious outsider, but as someone who had become part of the local community. One of the older articles finally gave Ryan what he needed. It was a short feature about a community fundraiser and food event. Rebecca Carter had been mentioned as a longtime resident who regularly participated in local charity activities and seasonal fairs. The photograph accompanying the article was far clearer than the one Ryan had first found. There was no longer room for reasonable doubt in his mind. The woman was Claire. Age had changed her face, but it had not erased the details Ryan remembered. The shape of her features remained familiar. The mark near her neck was visible again. More important than any single physical feature was the combination of details that matched old family photographs stored for decades. Claire Bennett had survived. She had not vanished into an unknown grave in Arizona. She had not been living under her married name. She had spent years in Oregon as Rebecca Carter. For a brief period, that discovery could have been interpreted as good news. Ryan had spent most of his adult life preparing himself for the possibility that Claire had been murdered. Finding evidence that she had lived for decades should have brought relief. Instead, the article created a new problem almost immediately. The short biography attached to Rebecca Carter described her as a woman who had moved to Oregon in the early 1990s after suffering a devastating family tragedy in Ohio. According to the article, her mother and younger brother had died in a house fire. Ryan read the information repeatedly because the lie was so specific that it could not be explained as a misunderstanding. There had been no house fire. Ryan was alive. Margaret had remained in Ohio for years after Claire disappeared. Whoever had created the identity of Rebecca Carter had not merely changed Claire's name. Someone had created a complete explanation for why she had no living family who might visit, call, or appear unexpectedly. The realization changed the meaning of Claire's disappearance. If she had simply escaped Derek and chosen not to return home, she could have told people that she was estranged from her relatives. She could have said she came from a difficult family. She could have given vague answers and avoided details. Instead, she had told people her mother and brother were dead. That suggested planning. Ryan continued through the Oak Ridge archives. Rebecca appeared in several photographs taken over different years. In many of them, a man named Calvin Pierce appeared near her. Some references identified him as her husband. Others simply referred to Calvin and Rebecca Carter as longtime local residents. The name meant nothing to Ryan at first. The face did. The man was much older than Ryan remembered, but age had not erased the connection completely. Ryan returned to old records from 1990 and compared them with what he had found in Oregon. Calvin Pierce had been a young police officer in Youngstown when Claire disappeared. Ryan remembered him from the first days of the case. Calvin had been one of the officers who helped the Bennett family understand how information would be exchanged between Ohio and Arizona. Because Claire was living in Tucson, much of the early confusion had involved jurisdiction, phone calls between departments, and the uncertainty surrounding whether she was missing voluntarily or in danger. Calvin had been close enough to the case to know the details. He knew Claire had called Ryan in fear. He knew Ryan rejected Derek's explanation. He knew the Arizona authorities had eventually treated the case as a possible voluntary disappearance. And now, 31 years later, Calvin Pierce was living in Oregon with the woman the police had never found. Ryan began checking Calvin's employment history. The records showed that Calvin had left law enforcement less than a year after Claire vanished. His departure had not been connected publicly to the Bennett case. There was no obvious scandal attached to his resignation. On paper, it looked like an ordinary career change followed by relocation. But in Ryan's mind, the timing was impossible to ignore. Claire disappeared in 1990. Calvin participated in the early handling of the case. Within months, he left the department. Claire later appeared in Oregon under a false identity. Calvin appeared there with her. The pattern did not yet explain what had happened, but it destroyed the idea that Claire's disappearance had been random. Ryan turned next to Derek Lawson. For decades, Derek had been the center of Ryan's suspicions. Ryan had believed that Derek either killed Claire or forced her into hiding. Yet Derek had always been strangely difficult to trace. There were few reliable records connecting him to Youngstown before he met Claire. His supposed work history was vague. His family background had never produced anything useful. By 2021, public databases had improved enough for Ryan to compare old information more carefully. He searched the name Derek Lawson using the identifying details available from the marriage records and the information Claire had once provided to the family. The result created another contradiction. A man named Derek Lawson matching key identifying information had existed. But that man had died years before Claire ever met the person who used his name. Ryan initially considered the possibility of a database error or two unrelated men sharing similar information. He checked again through additional records. The conclusion remained the same. The identity Claire's husband had used in 1990 belonged to a dead man. The person who arrived in Youngstown, dated Claire, married her, and took her to Arizona had entered her life under a stolen identity. Ryan could no longer think of him simply as Derek Lawson. Whatever his real name had been, the marriage itself had begun with deception. That discovery forced Ryan to reconsider the entire sequence from 1990. A man using the identity of someone already dead had entered Claire's life. He had quickly married her. He had moved her across the country. Claire had called home in fear and disappeared shortly afterward. A young police officer involved in the case had later left law enforcement. That same officer was now living in Oregon with Claire under another name. The pieces were finally connecting, but they created a picture more disturbing than the one Ryan had carried for 31 years. Claire was alive. Her identity was false. Her family history in Oregon was false. Her first husband's identity had also been false. And Calvin Pierce, a police officer who had been close to the original investigation, had somehow become part of Claire's secret life. Ryan still did not know whether Calvin had saved Claire, controlled her, helped abduct her, or participated in something even worse. But one conclusion had become unavoidable. Claire Bennett had not simply disappeared in 1990. Someone had helped make her disappear. And Calvin Pierce had almost certainly known the truth for decades. Ryan went to Oregon without contacting Claire first. By then, the evidence he had collected had changed the nature of the search. He was no longer trying to determine whether his sister was alive. He believed she was. The more urgent question was why Claire Bennett had become Rebecca Carter, why her family had been erased from her new history, and why Calvin Pierce, a former Youngstown police officer connected to her disappearance, had spent decades living beside her. Oak Ridge was small enough that long-term residents were known to one another, but Ryan understood that asking too many direct questions could expose his presence before he understood what he was dealing with. He kept his inquiries limited and framed them as an attempt to locate an old family acquaintance. What he learned was surprisingly ordinary. Rebecca Carter and Calvin Pierce had lived in the area for many years. They were viewed locally as a married couple with a private but stable life. Rebecca had participated in community events and charity activities. Calvin had worked outside law enforcement after leaving Ohio. Neither of them had attracted the kind of rumors Ryan expected to hear about people hiding a violent secret. That normality disturbed him more than suspicion would have. For 31 years, Ryan had imagined Claire as someone trapped in danger. In his mind, Derek Lawson had remained the likely source of that danger, while Calvin Pierce had gradually become a possible accomplice. Yet the information in Oak Ridge suggested something else. Claire was not publicly isolated. She was not known as a woman under obvious control. She had built relationships in the community and maintained the same identity for decades. Ryan began observing the property where Rebecca and Calvin lived. What he saw did not support the idea of captivity. There was no visible pattern suggesting Claire was being kept away from other people. She appeared connected to local life and recognized by neighbors. The relationship between her and Calvin presented itself as an established marriage rather than the arrangement Ryan had feared. That realization created a new kind of anger. If Claire had been free all these years, then Ryan had to consider the possibility that she had chosen not to contact him. He had spent 3 decades believing she was dead or unable to return. Margaret had died with the same uncertainty. Every unanswered letter, every failed search, every year without a phone call suddenly carried a different meaning. But Ryan could not make that conclusion fit with the final call from 1990. Claire had been afraid. She had said Derek was not the man the family believed him to be. She had wanted to come home. The call had ended with a violent interruption. Nothing about that memory suggested a young woman calmly preparing to disappear and construct a second life. Ryan also could not ignore Calvin's presence. A police officer involved in the original case did not simply end up married to the missing woman by coincidence. There had to be a connection between what happened in Arizona and the life Claire later created in Oregon. He needed evidence strong enough to explain that connection. The property records Ryan had reviewed gave him a basic understanding of the home and the land associated with Calvin and Rebecca. During his effort to learn more, he became aware of a secured lower area beneath part of the house. It was not something mentioned in the local articles or public descriptions of their life, but it appeared to have been deliberately kept inaccessible. Ryan's judgment had already been worn down by 31 years of obsession. He knew entering someone else's home without permission was illegal. He also knew that if Calvin had used his law enforcement experience to help conceal Claire's disappearance, warning the police too early might accomplish nothing. Ryan had already lived through one investigation in which Claire's disappearance had been dismissed without a full understanding of what happened. When he determined that the property was temporarily unoccupied, he made the decision that would later place him in legal jeopardy. He entered the house. Nothing he found in the ordinary living areas immediately explained the past. The records and household documents he encountered were consistent with the names Calvin Pierce and Rebecca Carter. There was no obvious collection of material from Youngstown, no open file about Claire Bennett, and no simple piece of evidence proving what had happened in 1990. Then Ryan located the secured basement area. The access had been deliberately locked. That alone did not prove a crime. People secured storage areas for countless reasons. But Ryan had reached a point where every unusual detail surrounding Calvin and Claire carried the weight of decades of unanswered questions. He forced access. The space below contained stored property accumulated over many years. Much of it appeared ordinary. Ryan expected documents, old police files, perhaps photographs or records connecting Claire's original identity to the life she had built as Rebecca. Instead, he found something much larger. A vehicle had been concealed beneath a heavy covering. When Ryan exposed enough of it to identify the model, recognition came immediately. It was a Chevrolet Camaro from the late 1980s. The same kind of car Derek Lawson had driven in Youngstown. The same car associated in Ryan's memory with Claire's departure from Ohio. Ryan examined it more carefully. Age and long storage had changed its condition, but certain details matched what he remembered from 1990. The vehicle had not been abandoned in Arizona. It had not disappeared with Derek after Claire was reported missing. It had been transported to Oregon and hidden beneath the home where Claire had lived with Calvin. That fact alone connected the two men in a way Ryan had never been able to prove. Then he saw damage to the windshield. It was not consistent with weather, age, or an ordinary road accident. The pattern indicated that a bullet had passed through the glass. Inside, the driver's side contained old staining that immediately raised a more serious possibility. Ryan did not need forensic training to understand that the amount and location were consistent with a major injury involving blood. The disappearance suddenly took on an entirely different shape. For 31 years, Derek had been treated as the husband left behind by a woman who supposedly walked away. Later, Derek himself had vanished from the known record. Now his car was hidden beneath the home of Claire Bennett and Calvin Pierce. And that car appeared to contain evidence of a shooting. Ryan began to understand that Derek may never have left Arizona alive. If that was true, then Claire's disappearance and Derek's disappearance were not separate mysteries. They were parts of the same event. The false identity Derek had used, Calvin's resignation from the police department, Claire's new name, the fabricated story about her family dying, and the vehicle concealed beneath the house all pointed toward a coordinated effort to bury something that happened in 1990. Ryan still did not know who had fired the gun. He did not know whether Claire had witnessed a killing, participated in one, or had been forced into silence afterward. He did not know whether Calvin had protected her or controlled her. For the first time, however, he had physical evidence that the past had not ended with a missing person report. Before Ryan could determine anything more, the situation changed. Claire and Calvin returned to the property. Calvin quickly realized that someone had been inside the house. The secured basement had been opened. Ryan was still below it. 31 years after Claire vanished from Youngstown, Ryan had finally reached the secret that someone had worked for decades to keep hidden. And now the person most closely connected to that secret knew an intruder had found it. Calvin understood almost immediately that the house had been breached. The secured lower level was no longer sealed, and the arrangement of the access point made it clear that whoever had entered had not stopped at the ordinary rooms. For Calvin, the possibility of theft was secondary. The basement contained evidence connected to a death from 1990, evidence he had spent 31 years keeping out of sight. Claire did not know who had entered or why. The safest response was to involve local law enforcement. Calvin told her to go directly to the sheriff's office and report the break-in while he remained at the property. Ryan heard enough from below to understand that the situation had changed completely. Until that moment, he had been the one searching for answers. Now Calvin knew someone had found the basement. Ryan also understood that his own decision to enter the house had put him in a dangerous position. He had no legal authority to be there. He had broken into a private residence and forced access to a locked area. If police arrived before he could explain the car and the history behind it, he could easily be treated as the offender. But the greater danger was Calvin. Ryan had spent 31 years wondering whether a police officer had helped conceal Claire's disappearance. Now he was trapped beneath that officer's home beside a blood-stained car associated with Claire's first husband. Calvin retrieved a shotgun kept legally in the house. From his perspective, an unknown person had broken into his home and opened a basement containing something that could expose a decades-old criminal cover-up. He did not yet know the intruder was Ryan Bennett. The confrontation developed quickly. Ryan remained below, unable to leave without passing through the only practical route back into the house. Calvin knew the basement had been opened and began trying to force the intruder to reveal himself. Ryan did not respond. He had no weapon. He also had no reason to trust Calvin's intentions. Whatever the truth eventually proved to be, Calvin had concealed evidence of a death for decades. Ryan could not assume that a man capable of maintaining that secret would react calmly after being discovered. The tension intensified when Calvin entered the lower level with the shotgun. Ryan tried to keep distance between them and avoid presenting himself as an immediate target. The confined layout made any attempt to escape difficult. Calvin could not clearly identify the person below, while Ryan knew exactly who was coming toward him. For several moments, neither man had control of the situation. Then a shot was fired. The blast struck the wall rather than Ryan. Whether it came from panic, misjudgment, or an attempt to force the intruder from cover no longer mattered. The sound changed the incident from a property crime into a potentially lethal confrontation. Ryan understood that he could not remain there much longer. Calvin understood the same thing. Before either man could escalate further, law enforcement vehicles began arriving at the property. Claire had reached the sheriff's office and reported the break-in. The arrival of deputies immediately changed Calvin's options. He knew the basement would be discovered. He knew the Camaro would be seen. He also knew that explaining why a vehicle associated with a 31-year-old disappearance was hidden beneath his home would be impossible without reopening everything he had worked to conceal. Calvin left the house and moved toward the wooded area beyond the property rather than remain to face the arriving deputies. Ryan stayed below. When officers entered the home, they first treated the situation as an active break-in involving an armed homeowner and an unknown intruder. They had no context for the history connecting Ryan, Claire, Calvin, and the car beneath the house. Ryan was located in the basement. From the deputy's perspective, the facts were initially simple. A man from out of state had entered a private residence without permission, forced access to a locked basement, and was discovered after the homeowner reported an intrusion. Ryan was detained. He immediately tried to explain that the woman known locally as Rebecca Carter was actually his sister, Claire Bennett, who had disappeared from Ohio in 1990. At first, the explanation sounded impossible. Ryan then directed the deputies to the Camaro. Once law enforcement examined the vehicle, the tone of the incident changed. The car was not simply an old vehicle stored illegally or hidden for sentimental reasons. Its vehicle identification information connected it to records associated with the disappearance investigation involving Claire Bennett and the man known as Derek Lawson. The damage to the windshield suggested gunfire. The staining inside the driver's area raised an immediate forensic concern. The deputies secured the basement and notified investigators. Ryan remained detained because his unlawful entry had not disappeared simply because he had discovered possible evidence of another crime. But the officers no longer viewed him as an ordinary burglar. His claims about Claire's identity and the history of the vehicle now required verification. The property was treated as a potential crime scene. Additional law enforcement personnel arrived. The Camaro was documented, and steps were taken to preserve whatever evidence remained after more than 3 decades. At the same time, a search began for Calvin Pierce. He had not remained at the house after deputies arrived, and the presence of the shotgun made the search more urgent. Officers extended the search into the surrounding area, working on the assumption that Calvin could still be armed. Claire was brought back to the property as part of the investigation. For Ryan, that moment was more difficult than discovering the car. 31 years had passed since he had last known Claire as his 23-year-old sister preparing for a new life with Derek. Now she was standing within the same investigation that had consumed nearly all of his adult life. There was no uncertainty about her identity anymore. Claire was alive. But Ryan still did not know why. He did not know whether she had been forced into silence for decades or whether she had willingly helped bury the truth. He did not know whether Calvin had protected her or manipulated her. He did not know whose blood was inside the Camaro or who had fired the shot that damaged the windshield. Claire did not immediately give him answers. Law enforcement separated the people involved and began treating the case as something far larger than the reported break-in that had brought them there. The search for Calvin ended not long afterward. Deputies located him away from the house and took him into custody without further violence. The shotgun was recovered. With Calvin detained, investigators could finally begin separating the events of that day from the unresolved events of 1990. Ryan's handcuffs remained in place while officers verified his identity and reviewed the old missing person information. He had committed a real offense by entering the house, but the discovery beneath it now demanded a much broader investigation. Claire agreed to provide a statement. She also made one condition clear to investigators. Ryan needed to be present when she explained what had happened. For 31 years, he had believed Derek Lawson was responsible for taking Claire away. After seeing the hidden Camaro, Ryan had begun to believe Calvin Pierce had murdered Derek and then helped Claire disappear. Claire's first disclosure destroyed that theory. Calvin had not killed Derek. The person responsible for Derek's death was Claire herself. Claire's statement forced Ryan to confront a possibility he had never seriously considered. For 31 years, he had believed his sister had either been murdered or forced into a life she could not escape. Even after finding her in Oregon, he had assumed Calvin Pierce stood at the center of whatever crime had taken place. The hidden Camaro, the old blood, and the bullet damage had seemed to confirm that someone had died and that Calvin had helped bury the evidence. Claire now admitted that the person who died in that car was the man their family had known as Derek Lawson. And she had fired the gun. The story began almost immediately after Claire left Ohio in 1990. The life Derek had promised in Tucson did not exist. There was no stable job waiting for him. There was no respectable position in industrial sales. The confident man who had impressed Margaret and persuaded Claire that he could offer her a better future had constructed that image carefully. Once Claire was isolated from her family, the relationship changed. Derek controlled the money. He controlled transportation. He controlled access to documents and communication. Claire quickly learned that even ordinary choices could become reasons for punishment. The Sunday phone calls Ryan remembered so clearly had not been private. Derek monitored them. He expected Claire to sound normal. He wanted Margaret and Ryan to believe that the marriage was working and that the move to Arizona had been successful. Claire understood that if she said too much, the consequences would not be limited to her. Derek knew where Margaret and Ryan lived in Youngstown. He used that knowledge deliberately. Claire told investigators that Derek repeatedly threatened to return to Ohio if she tried to leave or contact police. He made it clear that Margaret and Ryan could be harmed because of anything Claire did. For Claire, that threat became more powerful than the abuse itself. She could imagine surviving fear directed at her. She could not risk bringing it back to her family. That was why the calls became shorter. That was why Ryan had heard hesitation and strain in her voice. Claire was not losing interest in her family. She was trying to protect them without letting Derek realize what she was doing. By September 1990, the situation had become more dangerous. Derek had grown more unpredictable. Claire understood that the threats were no longer being used only to control her. She believed he was preparing to remove her permanently. The final Sunday call happened after Claire became convinced she might not survive the night. She found a brief opportunity to use the phone without Derek immediately stopping her. Ryan had answered. Claire did not have time to explain everything. She only managed to tell him that Derek was not who they thought he was, that she needed to leave, and that Ryan had to take care of Margaret if something happened. Then Derek discovered the call. That was the disturbance Ryan had heard. The terrified cry that had followed was real. Derek ended the call and forced Claire to leave the residence with him. He drove the Camaro away from Tucson toward a more isolated area. Claire believed he intended to kill her. There was no misunderstanding in her mind about what was happening. The threats that had been repeated for weeks now seemed to be turning into something final. At some point during the drive, Derek reached for the firearm he kept inside the vehicle. Claire knew about the gun. She had seen it before. What happened next lasted only moments but determined everything that followed. Claire reached the weapon first. She fired. Derek was struck while seated in the driver's position. The car stopped. For the first time since leaving Ohio, Claire was no longer under Derek's control. But freedom did not feel like freedom. She was 23 years old, alone in Arizona, beside a dead man whose true identity she did not understand. Then she discovered what Derek had been hiding. There was a large amount of cash inside the vehicle. There were multiple forms of identification. Some carried names Claire had never heard. The documents did not fit the life Derek had described. Claire realized the man she married had not merely lied about his employment. His entire identity might have been false. That discovery created a new fear. If she went directly to police and reported that she had killed her husband, officers would find the money, false identification, and other suspicious material. Claire worried that investigators would assume she had known about Derek's activities. She also remembered his repeated threats that other people knew who she was and where her family lived. Claire had no way to know whether those threats were real. But after everything else she had discovered, she no longer believed they were empty. She needed help from someone she trusted. The first person she thought of was Calvin Pierce. Calvin had known Claire before the marriage through his work in Youngstown. He had been a young officer then, and Claire remembered him as someone who had treated her family with respect. She contacted the Youngstown Police Department. Calvin answered. Claire told him what had happened. She told him about Derek's abuse, the threats against Margaret and Ryan, the drive away from Tucson, the gun, the shooting, the cash, and the false identification. Calvin did not tell her to immediately surrender herself to the nearest Arizona station. Instead, he asked her to remain where she could be contacted and avoid speaking to anyone else until he understood what she had found. 3 days later, Calvin arrived in Arizona. By then, Claire's life had already divided into two parts. There was the life before Derek, when she had been Claire Bennett from Youngstown. And there was everything that came after the moment she fired the gun. Ryan listened to the account with the anger he had carried for decades beginning to change shape. The sister he thought had abandoned him had been trying to keep him alive. The strange phone calls had not been indifference. The final scream had not been staged. And the man he had spent 31 years blaming had not simply been a difficult husband. Derek Lawson had been something far more dangerous. Claire had survived him. But when Calvin reached Arizona and examined what Derek had left behind, the situation became even more complicated. That was when the decision was made that would erase Claire Bennett from public life for the next 31 years. When Calvin reached Arizona 3 days after Claire's call, he immediately understood that the situation was more serious than a domestic violence case that had ended in self-defense. The man Claire knew as Derek Lawson had been carrying multiple forms of identification, large amounts of unexplained cash, and records that did not match the background he had given her in Ohio. Calvin knew enough about criminal investigations to recognize that this was not simply a husband hiding an affair or financial trouble. The pattern suggested someone who had deliberately built a false identity and expected to abandon it whenever necessary. Claire was terrified that the people connected to Derek would come looking for her. She had no way to know whether every threat he made had been true, but by then she had already discovered that nearly everything about him had been fabricated. He had lied about his work, his past, his name, and the life he intended to build with her. There was no reason to believe his warnings about dangerous associates were empty. For Calvin, that created two separate problems. The first was legal. Claire had killed a man. Even if the shooting had occurred in self-defense, the circumstances surrounding the death were complicated by the false identification, unexplained cash, and Derek's unknown criminal history. Claire feared that police would initially see only a dead man, a frightened young wife, and evidence connected to crimes she could not explain. The second problem was personal. Derek had known exactly where Margaret and Ryan lived in Youngstown. Claire believed that if the people connected to him discovered she had survived, they could use her family to find her or punish her. Calvin made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of taking Claire directly into the formal criminal justice system, he decided to help her disappear. It was not a lawful decision. Calvin knew that. He was a sworn police officer, and he understood that evidence was supposed to be preserved, deaths reported, and investigations allowed to proceed. But in that moment, he believed the legal system could not guarantee Claire's safety quickly enough, especially when no one yet knew who Derek really was or who might be connected to him. Calvin used his position to influence the information moving between Arizona and Ohio. The account that reached the Bennett family remained consistent with the idea that Claire had left Derek voluntarily. The absence of an obvious crime scene at the Tucson residence made that explanation easier to maintain. Derek was presented as a husband who had been abandoned rather than a dead man whose identity was fraudulent. That false version became the foundation of the missing person file. Calvin then prepared to leave law enforcement. He understood that continuing as an officer while hiding what had happened would become impossible. Within months, he resigned from the department and began separating himself from his former life in Ohio. Claire also had to disappear completely. A new name alone would not be enough. If she resurfaced somewhere under a slightly altered identity, basic questions about family, schools, employment, and marriage could eventually expose her. She needed a history that explained why no relatives ever visited and why there was no one from her old life who could verify her past. Claire became Rebecca Carter. The name was new. The family story was new as well. She and Calvin eventually settled in Oak Ridge, Oregon, where they could live far from Ohio and Arizona without drawing attention to the events of 1990. The explanation Claire used for her past was intentionally simple and painful. She told people that her mother and younger brother had died in a house fire in Ohio. The lie accomplished what they needed. It gave neighbors and acquaintances a reason not to ask why Rebecca Carter never returned home for holidays, why no relatives called, and why no childhood friends appeared. For Claire, that lie carried a private cost that no one in Oregon understood. Margaret was still alive. Ryan was still alive. Every time Claire repeated the story, she was declaring the two people she loved most to be dead, in order to protect the life she had been forced to leave behind. The Camaro created another problem. The vehicle was still traceable through its identification number. Calvin could not simply take it to a salvage yard and expect no questions. A car associated with false records, a dead man, and blood evidence could become the one object capable of unraveling everything. Leaving it in Arizona was equally dangerous. Someone could eventually discover it. The vehicle had to disappear with Claire. Calvin arranged to move it to Oregon. Later, when he acquired property outside Oak Ridge, the basement was built to conceal the Camaro permanently. The vehicle was placed below the house and kept out of sight for decades. It became the physical center of a secret that otherwise existed mostly in old files, false names, and memories. Over the years, Claire and Calvin's relationship changed. What began as an emergency alliance between a terrified young woman and a police officer who had chosen to protect her became something far more permanent. Calvin had given up his career and his life in Ohio. Claire had given up her name, her family, and every connection to the person she had been before 1990. They built a life together under those consequences. Eventually, they married. To the people around them, Rebecca Carter and Calvin Pierce were simply a longtime couple who had lived quietly in Oregon for years. No one knew that Rebecca was Claire Bennett. No one knew that the vehicle beneath their home connected them directly to an unresolved disappearance in Ohio. No one knew that the entire life they had created had begun with a dead man in Arizona. In 2021, after Ryan discovered the Camaro and law enforcement reopened the history behind the case, investigators began processing the evidence that had survived inside the vehicle. The most important breakthrough came from identifying the dead man. The person Claire had married under the name Derek Lawson was actually Nathan Cole. The name immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Nathan had been wanted by federal authorities under multiple aliases. His record included serious violent offenses, and investigators found connections to earlier cases involving women who had disappeared or been subjected to severe violence before he vanished from official records in 1990. The identity confirmed that Claire had not invented the danger surrounding him. The man had entered her life using a stolen name because he was already hiding from law enforcement. His promises in Youngstown had been part of a constructed identity. His threats in Arizona had come from someone who was accustomed to violence and deception. The evidence also supported the central part of Claire's account. The shooting had occurred during a situation in which she reasonably believed her life was in immediate danger. The physical evidence from the Camaro, combined with Nathan's history and the circumstances Claire described, made the self-defense explanation credible. Calvin's role was different. He had not killed Nathan Cole, but he had concealed the death. He had helped move the evidence. He had manipulated the original investigation, and he had spent 31 years maintaining a false version of what happened. When questioned separately, Calvin admitted what he had done. His account matched Claire's in the key details. By then, Ryan finally understood the distinction he had been unable to see when he first found his sister. Calvin was not the man who had taken Claire away from her family. He was the man who had helped her disappear after she survived Nathan Cole. That did not erase what he had done wrong. It did not restore the years Margaret and Ryan had lost. But it changed the moral center of the story. For the first time since 1990, the truth was no longer divided between a missing person file, a false identity, and a secret buried beneath a house in Oregon. Claire Bennett had survived. Nathan Cole had not. And Calvin Pierce had spent 31 years living with the consequences of choosing protection over the law. The legal review that followed was slower and more complicated than Ryan had imagined during the years when he believed one clear answer would solve everything. Investigators had to separate three different questions. The first concerned Nathan Cole's death. The second concerned Calvin Pierce's decision to conceal that death and interfere with the original investigation. The third concerned Claire Bennett's disappearance and the false identity she had lived under for 31 years. The evidence recovered in 2021 supported Claire's account in the most important respect. Nathan had not been an innocent husband killed during an ordinary marital dispute. His true identity, criminal history, use of aliases, possession of false documents, and record of serious violence all gave investigators a much clearer understanding of the danger Claire had faced in 1990. The physical evidence that remained in the Camaro was also consistent with the basic sequence she described. After reviewing the available material, prosecutors determined there was no realistic basis for charging Claire with murder. Everything that could still be established pointed toward a shooting committed during an immediate threat to her life. That conclusion did not erase the years of secrecy. It did not mean every decision made afterward had been lawful. But it meant Claire would not spend the final years of her life defending herself against the man who had terrorized her more than 3 decades earlier. Calvin's case was more difficult. He had been a police officer. He understood evidence preservation. He understood reporting requirements. He understood that using his position to influence the flow of information between agencies crossed a line that ordinary people might not fully appreciate. He had chosen to cross it anyway. The question in 2021 was not whether Calvin had acted properly. He had not. The question was what could still be prosecuted after 31 years. Some potential offenses related to false reporting, interference with records, and concealment were affected by statutes of limitation. Other possible charges were weakened by the age of the evidence, the death of Nathan, and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the original event. The prosecutor's office made clear that Calvin's conduct should not be mistaken for legal innocence simply because time had made prosecution difficult. There was also no evidence that Calvin had killed Nathan or used Claire's disappearance for personal gain. What he had done was make a decision outside the law because he believed the law could not protect Claire quickly enough. That decision saved one life in the short term. It also caused enormous damage over the long term. Ryan understood both truths. That was the hardest part. For decades, he had wanted the story to contain one villain. At first, that villain had been Derek. Later, after discovering Claire in Oregon, Ryan had transferred much of that anger to Calvin. The truth refused to remain that simple. Nathan Cole had been the real threat. Claire had survived him. Calvin had protected Claire, but he had also helped destroy the Bennett family's ability to know what happened. Margaret had died believing her daughter was gone. Ryan had built most of his adult life around an unanswered question. Claire had lived under a false name while knowing that every year of silence created more pain for the people she was trying to protect. No legal ruling could repair any of that. Claire was eventually allowed to move forward without being treated as a murder suspect. For the first time since 1990, she could acknowledge publicly that Rebecca Carter was not the name she had been born with. She did not immediately abandon the identity completely. Rebecca had been the name attached to most of her adult life. It was the name known by neighbors, community members, and people who had never heard of Claire Bennett. But Ryan began calling her Claire again. That mattered more than any official form. Their reunion did not become instantly comfortable. 31 years could not be repaired by a few emotional conversations. Ryan still had moments when he remembered Margaret and felt anger return. Claire understood that. She did not ask him to forgive everything at once. She also did not defend every decision she and Calvin had made. She knew they could have chosen differently. They could have reported Nathan's death. They could have trusted investigators. They could have tried to establish self-defense through the legal system. But Claire also remembered who she had been in 1990. 23 years old, isolated, terrified, surrounded by evidence of a criminal life she did not understand, and convinced that the people she loved could be harmed because of her. Ryan slowly learned to judge that younger version of his sister separately from the woman sitting before him in 2021. Natalie became important during that process. She had spent years living beside Ryan's grief without ever meeting the person at the center of it. When Claire was finally introduced to Ryan's family, the meeting carried the weight of an entire missing generation. Claire learned about the children Ryan had raised. She learned about birthdays, graduations, family losses, marriages, and ordinary events that had happened while she lived in Oregon under another name. Ryan learned about the life Claire and Calvin had built. There had been no hidden criminal empire, no ongoing scheme, no second group of victims. There had been work, bills, neighbors, community events, and the routines of two people trying to live beyond one catastrophic decision. That normality made the lost years feel even more painful. Claire could have known Ryan's children. Margaret could have known her daughter survived. Ryan could have spent 31 years with a sister instead of a case file. None of those possibilities could be recovered. By the end of 2021, Claire and Ryan had established something neither of them had expected to have again. Regular contact. The first few calls were difficult. There was too much history in every silence. Over time, they became more ordinary. That was what Ryan had wanted without knowing how to describe it. Not a dramatic reunion. Not endless explanations. Ordinary family life. Claire had once promised him in 1990 that she would call every Sunday. For 31 years, That promise had become one of the most painful memories Ryan carried. Now Sunday became theirs again. Some weeks they talked about the case. Most weeks they did not. They talked about family, food, work, health, old memories, and the small things people discuss when they expect to speak again soon. That expectation changed everything. Ryan no longer ended a conversation wondering whether it might be the last time he heard his sister's voice. Claire no longer lived with the belief that contact with her family would place them in danger. Calvin remained part of her life, but the secrecy that had defined their marriage was gone. He could not undo the choices he made as a young police officer. Claire could not give Margaret the truth she had been denied. Ryan could not reclaim the years he spent searching. What they could do was stop allowing 1990 to take anything else from them. For most of his life, Ryan believed closure meant discovering exactly who was guilty. In the end, he learned that closure was something more difficult. It meant accepting a truth that did not fit neatly into innocence and blame. Claire had survived because she fought back. Calvin had helped save her and also helped create decades of grief. Ryan had been wrong about some things and right about others. Margaret had died without the answer she deserved. Nothing about that was fair. But the story did not end where the damage began. It ended with two siblings choosing to use the time they still had. Sometimes survival does not produce a clean ending. Sometimes the people who save us make terrible mistakes. Sometimes love protects badly. Fear makes decisions that reason would reject. And good intentions leave wounds that last for years. What matters afterward is not pretending those wounds never existed. It is deciding whether they will be the only thing left. Claire Bennett lost 31 years with her family. Ryan Bennett lost 31 years with his sister. Neither could change that. But in 2021, they finally stopped counting only what had been taken from them. They began counting what remained. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Every story we share is more than a sequence of events. It is a reminder that behind every disappearance, every painful decision, and every unanswered question, there are people carrying emotions that may remain hidden for years. Claire and Ryan's journey reminds us that truth is not always simple, and that people sometimes make difficult choices when they are frightened, desperate, or trying to protect someone they love. It also teaches us that even after many years of loss, regret, and misunderstanding, there can still be room for forgiveness, healing, and a new beginning. We cannot recover the time that has already passed, but we can choose how to use the time that remains. We hope this story gave you something meaningful to reflect on and perhaps reminded you to value the people who are still beside you today. Sometimes one phone call, one honest conversation, or one act of understanding can carry more importance than we realize. If you would like to support our channel, you only need to leave a like, share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you more emotional, meaningful, and human stories. Thank you again for listening, for staying with us until the end, and for being part of this community.